Okay. One of the things that trait theorists try to do is to try to identify the basic traits that human beings have. There is it makes sense to consider that we are human beings and that we, since we're all maybe even from a biological point of view, we share, so of course we share biological features, but do we also share certain personality features? Sure, again, individuals differ, but is the structure of our personality is similar? Maybe think about the structure of our bodies are similar. So is the structure of our personality similar as well? Maybe just we have different aspects of it, but the basic structure may in fact be the same. And there have been a number of researchers, theorists, who have essentially tried to identify these traits. What are they? How many of them are there? How do we essentially define the personality structure of a human being? And again, this structure would again be more or less universal, that the structure, one person would be the same as the structure of another person, but there would just be differences among the different traits. Okay, one approach that has been used in the past to essentially identify these basic traits is to use what is called factor analysis. Okay? This is a statistical procedure which, simply put, is used to take a large number of pieces of information and condense it into a smaller number of pieces of information, where you might find that certain items tend to be similar to each other, and they would be grouped together, and that group might differ from another group. So basically, if you have 100 different potential personality characteristics, just pick up a dictionary and find many different personality traits listed in the dictionary. You started with 100, you might find that several of those 100 different personality traits have a lot of similarities. For example, extroversion and sociability. Those are two different words to describe people, but they basically mean, if not exactly the same thing, they are similar to each other. It's very unlikely that someone would say, I am very, very much extroverted, but I'm not at all sociable. Wouldn't seem to make much sense. If you are extroverted, if you're highly extroverted, you're probably also going to be highly sociable. If you're not very extroverted, you're probably also going to be not very sociable. Bottom line is, people are going to essentially respond similarly to those kinds of similar items. So you take that particular, based on that understanding, you can take a large number of items, analyze how people respond to those items, and then match up the items where people seem to be answering it the same way, and separate it from the other groups of items where people are answering them the same way. Okay? So it's based on the idea that, again, different items on a particular, let's say you want to create, you want to basically be able to identify the basic categories of personality. You just pick up a dictionary and you just list everyone and ask people, on a scale of 1 to 5, how much does this describe your personality? Okay? And, you match up how people answer similarly, two particular traits, people both answer 5 to, a whole bunch of people answer the same way to, then you can more or less group it together. And this factor analysis is done, again, it's a statistical procedure. You more or less just enter in the scores of the people in terms of the items that they entered. You essentially would, well, here, if you look at page 54 in the textbook, you really need to read this section of the textbook. It gives an idea. I want to point out that there's a minor mistake on it here. If you look at the chart on chart B on page 54, you will see that on factor C they circled the wrong numbers. The high factor loadings should be item 2, item 4, and item 5, 0.49, 0.56, and 0.50. Those high numbers reflect items that seem to fit with each other. But in the textbook they circled items 3, 5, and 6 by mistake, so just keep that in mind. But basically you start out with a large number of items, and how people respond will then determine how these items group together. Of course, if you only put in 50 different personality traits and you're missing out on a lot of other ones, then maybe your factor analysis is not going to be complete. What if you're only looking for a set number of personality traits and you're ignoring others? Again, you're leaving something out. So realize that what you get out of it is what you put into it. So keep that in mind. Okay, so basically the first step is, again, you would just collect a lot of measurements on the particular variables you're interested in. So if we're talking about personality traits, you might just, again, like I said before, put a set of questions here, 100 questions, 200 questions, whatever it happens to be, listing the different personality traits, how much does this describe your personality on a scale of 1 to 5, and people would circle their answers. That would be a self-report measure, and you would then be able to group how people responded to them. You could also do it as observational methods as well, rating people on particular characteristics and then grouping those things together. If you really want to do a factor analysis appropriately, you want to be able to do it from as many people as possible, not just like 2 or 3 or 4 people, certainly not just like one class. You want to be able to get it from a large number of people, particularly if we're talking about personality traits. If you want to generalize and say that personality traits are universal, well, then you should probably try to get a large representative sample of the population that you're interested in rather than just a sample that's nearby you, like just a bunch of college students. So you gather this information, you would get people's answers on those items, and again, those items should be quantitative responses, like on a scale of 1 to 5. And you would then compute correlations between all pairs of variables. So, if you were to ask, for example, to what extent does this trait describe your personality on a scale of 1 to 5? And item number 1 says extroversion. Item number 2 says sociability. Most people would score either exactly the same or pretty close to it. So maybe 4 on one, 5 on the other, or 4 on both, or 3 on both, or something like that. And if you were to take that item and correlate it with that item 1 and correlate it with item 2 over, let's say, 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people, then you'd probably find a high correlation between those two items. But you would do that for every item on that measure: assertiveness, conscientiousness, intelligence, happiness, whatever it happens to be, and you find out which items seem to correlate with each other the most. Where people who score high on one should score high on the other, people who score low on one should score low on the other. The ones that really hang close together can be grouped together into a particular factor. And essentially, statistically, you would basically, it would compute from these inter-item correlations, it would compute factor loadings. And from these factor loadings, you would be able to derive factors. So let's take a look. On page 50, go to page 54 and look at the numbers in part A. Part A represents a correlation matrix, a hypothetical one, a correlation matrix between the 7 items shown in that paragraph, and where each item is correlated with each other item. So item 1 shows a correlation with item 2 of 0.10. You look at on that page, item number 1 took action quickly before things could get out of hand. Item number 2 refused to believe that it was real, and this has to do with how people are responding to stress. If you look at item 1 and item 2, a 0.10 correlation is a pretty low correlation. It doesn't really, how people score on item 1 really has very little relationship to how they score on item 2. But what about the correlation between item 1 and item 3? Okay. So essentially, you want to find out, how people respond to a stressful event in the past year. Item number 1 took action quickly before things could get out of hand. Item 3 did something concrete to make the situation better. Item 1 and item 3 have a very strong correlation of 0.75. If you also look at that correlation box, matrix box A, look at the correlation between item 2 and item 5. Hypothetically, item 2 says refused to believe that it was real, and item 5 went on thinking things were just like they were. People who responded to item 2 tended to respond to item 5 in pretty much the same way. Not a perfect correlation, but pretty high. Again, this gives an indication of 2 items that seem to be more or less telling the same kind of story. Okay. Well, this is also shown here in the, this is essentially shown if you look at box B in the bottom corner, the hypothetical factor loadings. You would see, for example, that the factor loadings for item 1 and item 3. Look at item 1. Item 1 has factor loadings for factor A, B, and C. For factor A, 0.62. For factor B, 0.15. For factor C, 0.01. What you would say based on this is that item 1 loads pretty heavily on factor A and does not load very heavily on factor B or C. So on factor A, item 1 and item 3 have the highest loadings. So you would basically make the case that item 1 and item 3 belong on factor A, load on factor A. Okay? Factor B, items 6 and 7 seem to fall on that. Changed or grew as a person in a new way, tried to look on the bright side of things. So those 2 items, items 6 and 7, load highly on factor B. Factor C, and again I showed you that they made a mistake in the textbook, it's items 2, 4, and 5 that load highly on factor C. And again, you can kind of look at that as kind of like denial. Again, in other words, the names, we're calling them factor A, factor B, and factor C. But basically, the researcher would look at the items that fall heavily on that factor, and based on that, would name the factor and give it an appropriate name. So factor C might be called denial. Factor A might be called problem-focused coping, and factor B might be called positive reinterpretation or post-traumatic growth, or looking on the bright side. Again, if you look at that, if you read this box, this basically talks about this. But again, bottom line is factor analysis is a way of being able to organize this large number of information and be able to put items into appropriate categories. This is often also used for making, factorial analysis is often used in analyzing a particular personality scale. Let's say I wanted to create the Dresnik self-esteem scale. Like, there aren't enough self-esteem scales out there, but let's say I wanted to create the Dresnik self-esteem scale. And I made up 25 items that I think measure self-esteem. Number 1, I'm a worthy person. Number 2, I am a good person. Number 3, I feel good about myself. And on each of them I would rate on a scale of 1 to 5. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. Okay? So let's say I go through those 25 items. Let's say I believe that I'm measuring one thing, self-esteem. I'm not measuring anything else, I'm measuring self-esteem. To confirm that I am only measuring one variable and not, say, 3 or 4 or 5 variables, I would put my scores into a factor analysis to test how people responded. So I give my scale to, say, 100 or 200 people, and hopefully it would be representative of a population of interest, and I would conduct a factor analysis of it. If I were to make the conclusion that all of my items are measuring one thing, and one thing only, self-esteem, then I should find that every item on the scale would be highly correlated with every other item on the scale. People who respond to item 1 the way they respond to item 1 will be pretty similar to how they respond to items 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 25. Well, that's not likely to be the case, first of all. First of all, one thing is probably going to happen. Probably I may think I'm measuring self-esteem, but maybe I am measuring 2 or 3 or 4 different types of self-esteem. Maybe one has to do with how you feel about yourself. Maybe one has to do with your ability to succeed. And really, those are 2 kind of different things. They may be related to self-esteem in some way, but they're not exactly the same thing. So in other words, my single variable self-esteem scale may actually be measuring 3 or 4 variables. And that's why when you look up different kinds of personality scales, when you look at some articles you may be reading, you will actually find that many of those scales will have subscales. And what the subscales are when you do a factor analysis and you find instead of having one variable, you're actually measuring 2 or 3. So those 2 or 3 variables represent subscales of the particular personality scale. So maybe the Dresnik self-esteem scale, say, has 2 factors instead of 1. Maybe one factor could be defined as how you feel about yourself, and factor number 2 is how successful you think you are. Okay? 2 similar aspects to self-esteem, but really the way people respond to one factor may be different from how they respond to the other factor. But the items within each of those factors, people respond the same, similarly, and therefore they're grouped together. Okay? So that's one reason, is to do a factor analysis to test to see whether your personality scale is measuring one variable or is it measuring more than one variable. Another thing that happens when you run a factor analysis, though, very interesting. So let's say I've created a 25-item self-esteem scale. And let's say item 25 says, I like the color blue. Strongly disagree, strongly agree. Maybe I think liking the color blue has something to do with self-esteem. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. My guess is it has nothing to do with self-esteem. What would probably happen would be, if I did a factor analysis, is that item 25, asking you about how much you like the color blue, is probably not going to be highly correlated with any other item in the scale. It's going to have nothing to do with all the others. Therefore, it's not going to load highly on any factor. So if there are 2 factors, again, factors one that I'm naming how you feel, feeling good about yourself, and factor two, feeling how how successful you are. Color blue may have nothing to do with either of these, and therefore basically that item, which doesn't load highly on any factor, would get thrown in the trash bin. And that's often how you take a long form of a question of a personality scale, and it's translated into a short form. They take the items that really are high, that fit the various factors that are being measured very well. The ones that aren't very highly correlated, they go in the trash bin. So a factor analysis can identify subscales in what is presumably a single variable, but maybe it's actually more like 2 or 3 variables. And number two, it cleans up the scale by getting rid of items that are not highly correlated with anything else. So there's a little discussion about factor analysis. Again, read page 54, page 55. You get a better idea of this.